Alright guys, I am going to be jumping right into the Spanish-American War here. This is going to be the first war, I'm sorry about that, that we will be discussing this year. We talked a little bit about it in class, I believe. So I just want to kind of jump right in and see what we can kind of uncover together. So, first, Spanish Empire's falling. At the turn of the century, late 1800s, early 1900s, Spain has lost a lot of its colonies. And in fact, believe it or not, this guy Christopher Columbus, you may have heard of him before. Well, in 1492, when he sailed the Ocean Blue, he was sailing the Ocean Blue for Spain, for the Kingdom of Spain. And when he discovered America, you can see here in this map, everything in red is what or was once a Spanish colony. Now, fast forward a couple hundred years, and you have 4 colonies left. You have the Philippine Islands, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Guam. And I like this picture here. Do you speak Spanish? Because think about down here, all these Spanish-speaking territories. Well, that's because Spain was the original colonizer. Okay, so here are the 4 territories we're going to talk about on a map. You see here Hawaii. You see obviously the Philippine Islands in here, and you see Guam, Puerto Rico, Cuba. Right, so these are the areas that we're going to be talking about when we talk about the Spanish-American War. So what happened in Cuba? Well, there was a revolution happening in Cuba, and it was a Cuban revolution, and the Cuban people wanted their own independence from Spain. Spain sent over this guy, the Butcher. All right, he was pretty tough dude, and here he is down here, a picture of him in case you were wondering. And what this guy did is he used torture tactics and starvation tactics to basically get the Cuban people to stop revolting. It was kind of like mental warfare, because if you were captured, you were going to be tortured like this guy, and you were going to be starved in like a camp, in a prison camp, and that's the way it was going to go. Well, a problem with this is that there were news stories written about these events, and these news stories were written in American newspapers. Again, Cuba is only 90 miles from America. Okay, that's it. So this is kind of like in our backyard, and we call these news stories written during this period yellow journalism, because the stories were in fact exaggerated a little bit. The truth was kind of stretched. Yes, these starvation tactics were happening, but you know, when you look at it, you think it's happening to everyone. Well, was it really happening to everyone, or was it happening to just a few people? You know, it was more sensationalized, right, to sell newspapers, because you want to read all these really powerful stories about what's going on. So what we see is this thing we call yellow journalism. You should read about it. You'll read about it in chapter 23, section 2. So here's where things start to move a little faster. Because of what was happening in Cuba, President McKinley orders the USS Maine. It's a United States battleship, and it orders them to anchor outside of Havana. Havana is the capital of Cuba. And basically, why would he do this? Well, it's kind of like a threat, right? We're here, we're watching you, we're keeping your eye on you. We're not doing it, we're just kind of here, our presence is here. And lo and behold, 1 month after being docked outside of Cuba, kaboom, the USS Maine mysteriously explodes. 260 American sailors are killed. And again, the cause was unknown. We don't know who did it. Was it an accident? Did Spain blow us up with a mine, or was it an attack? What happened? So this was a very significant event, because this Maine explosion, and here are some pictures taken of the USS Maine. All right, these are historical documents. These pictures, these photographs, were circulated throughout the United States, and it really created a strong battle cry against Spain. And in fact, if you look at this mast here, right, the mast of this, whoa, look at that. All right, the mast here, you see it over here. We will actually see this exact mast on display in Arlington National Cemetery. Here it is right here. When we go on the Washington, D.C. trip, you will see this. We have to walk all the way up the top of the mountain, and you'll see that mast there as a remembrance to those sailors who lost their lives there. And again, The battle cry was, "Remember the Maine." So, what caused the Maine to explode? Well, it's a mystery. In fact, some historians today are still in disagreement as to what happened. But what's interesting is, due to yellow journalism, we're going to see who we think caused the Maine to explode. So again, here's an example of yellow journalism. You can see this is immediately after the event, okay? And it says right here in this article, destruction of the warship Maine was the work of an enemy. Well, we don't really know that. Today, we don't think it was. Today, we think it was just an accident. But how could you be so sure that this was a work of an enemy? And again, it says right here, explosion was not an accident. So you see the newspapers driving home the fact, telling American people, this wasn't an accident. This was the enemy. Somebody did this to us. Right? Naval officers think the Maine was destroyed by a Spanish mine. Here's, in a prominent newspaper, very famous news article, you see here's the Maine station. And down here, you see strapped to the bottom of the sea floor, this is an undersea mine. You can see the shape here. So in this newspaper, you actually see a mine underneath the boat. Was that mine actually there? Is there any evidence that that mine was there? No. But that's what naval officers believe. This was a mine that exploded. This was Spain. They attacked us. Again, this is all considered to be yellow journalism. Again, caused by a bomb or torpedo. Well, that turned out to not be true. It wasn't bombed or torpedoed. But again, right after the event, we're blaming it, okay, on an enemy, right? We are blaming it immediately on an enemy. And I love this picture. This is a picture depicting the explosion. What's really cool about this picture is, you know, I don't know, I wasn't there, but do you think these guys, these sailors, actually flew this high into the air? I mean, I doubt it. But again, it's sensationalized, the picture, so that you see it and you're like, oh my gosh, look at these guys are flung up into the air. How atrocious. This guy's flung this guy's flung over this way, right? It gives you a more powerful image. So again, this yellow journalism gets people to hate Spain. And in fact, that becomes the battle cry. Everybody says, remember the Maine, remember the Maine. In fact, I would say, to hell with Spain, remember the Maine. So William McKinley basically says, Spain, you have 3 days to leave Cuba. And guess what? If you don't leave Cuba in 3 days, we're coming in. Spain basically said, you know, we're not going to listen to you. Who are you? Who do you think you are? We didn't sink your battleship. You got your own problems. Don't bother us. So it's on like Donkey Kong right here. Now the battle begins. What's very interesting about the Spanish-American War is that, yes, the USS Maine sunk outside of Cuba, and so far all of our discussion has been about Cuba, 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 Cuba. Once we declare war on Spain, the first place we attack is not Cuba. The first place we attack are the Philippine Islands. Now, you have to ask yourself this question. Here are the Philippine Islands, right here. Why, if we're so concerned about Cuba and the Maine exploded outside of Cuba, and Cuba, 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 why is the first battle at the Philippine Islands? So we're going to try to answer that question tomorrow in class. So think about that one. So at the Philippine Islands, I kind of like this scene. It took me a little while to create. I thought it was funny. But at the Philippine Islands, it was a very quick battle for the U.S. In fact, there was a guy named Commodore Dewey was his name. He was the leading Commodore of the U.S. Navy. It was basically the U.S. Navy versus the Spanish Navy. And very quickly, in fact, it was called the Battle of Manila Bay. In a couple hours, not even days, like hours, we completely annihilated the entire Spanish Navy. In fact, not one U.S. battleship was damaged in this attack. And we basically sunk every single Spain battleship. So we basically owned them really, really, really bad. All right, huge, huge landslide victory for the U.S. So it was called the Battle of Manila Bay. It was over at the Philippine Islands. And it was a very large victory for the United States of America. So it's pretty cool. Next.
Deshaun Clark, please come to the front office.
Sorry about that.
Deshaun Clark.
So after the war, I'm not going to stop and record that one. After the Philippine Islands is wrapped up in about 6 hours, we focus our efforts on the war in Cuba. And this is where you see Teddy Roosevelt on the stage. Here he is right here. He was in charge of what's called the 1st Volunteer Cavalry. So these guys were volunteers. These guys were like cowboys and miners and college students, and they got the nickname the Rough Riders. And it's a really interesting story, and we could spend a ton of time talking about Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders. But basically, we focus our efforts on Cuba, and there's a very famous battle. It was called the Battle at San Juan Hill. And here are some images of that famous battle, where Teddy Roosevelt's platoon, these Rough Riders, were told, charge up San Juan Hill and secure this area. And it's really hard to advance up a hill. You're at an extreme disadvantage. Here's Teddy Roosevelt on his horse leading the charge up the hill. Again, here's Teddy Roosevelt here again. This is what makes Teddy Roosevelt the famous Teddy Roosevelt that we know. This put Teddy Roosevelt on the map, the Battle of San Juan Hill. We'll talk more about it in class. And here he is again, Teddy Roosevelt at the top there with his Rough Riders, okay, claiming the hill for America. And we'll talk about the Battle of San Juan Hill more in class. So the Spanish-American War was called a splendid little war. That's the terminology, because it only lasted about 6 months, the whole war. And in 6 months, we took all of Spain's colonies. So it was a really good war for us. And again, here's the American Empire. You can see Spain, again, their former colonies, all in this light green, all kind of gone. Now America gets this. Now America gets this. We talked about Alaska, right? The Wake Islands we get, Guam, Philippines. So as you can see, we're starting to expand our territories. What's interesting is what happens to these colonies after we take them over. Well, the most interesting stories probably deals with the Philippines. After we kick Spain out of the Philippine Islands, we basically annex the Philippines as a colony. Filipino people said, oh, no, you don't. You know, we just fought against Spain. We want our own independence. And what ensues is what's called the Philippine-American War. We crushed the Philippines. It wasn't close. In fact, some historians believe there was almost like a mass killing of Filipino people. It was so one-sided that eventually was put down. So the U.S. acquires the Philippine Islands as a colony, despite the fact that here they are fighting the Filipino people, the U.S. Soldiers fighting over that territory. Cuba is granted independence. We allow Cuba to sovereign themselves, to control their own government. However, with Cuba, we make them put something called the Platt Amendment. The Platt Amendment is really interesting because it's in their actual constitution. We have them write in the fact that the U.S. has the right to intervene in Cuba anytime there's a threat to life, liberty, and property. Okay, so it's interesting that we say you're okay, you get your own independence, but if there's a problem here, we can come in anytime we want. This Gloucester thing I'll show you in class. I'm not going to do that right now. Another part of that Platt Amendment is that we were able to have a naval base on Cuba. In fact, it's at Guantanamo Bay. You might have heard it before. It is the oldest naval base that we have. Today, it's used as a military prison and also as a detention camp. You'll hear that suspected terrorists are brought there. And in fact, a couple years ago, they got in trouble for doing some torturing of suspected terrorists using methods called waterboarding and things like that. So Guantanamo Bay is a naval base that we have. And again, here it is on the southern tip of Cuba. It's actually the only naval base we have in a country where we have nothing else, okay? Because Cuba, we pretty much have an embargo with Cuba at the moment. Puerto Rico, what do we do with Puerto Rico? Well, we obtain Puerto Rico as a colony. We do let them govern themselves, kind of similar to Cuba. However, we consider Puerto Rico today still a colony, and it's still considered a territory of the United States of America. It's considered an unincorporated territory. So we'll talk about the Anti-Imperialist League in class, about some people who thought, why are we going through imperialism? This is not a good idea. But we'll talk about that in class, and we'll talk more about some of these cartoons here. I'll flash real quick. But that's all. We're running out of time. we'll see you guys in class. So check these out, and we'll look at these in class.